160 minutes. That is the exact mathematical window between a heavy residential garage, door closing, and a life-saving medical device transmitting its final synchronous pulse of data. In the dark, early hours of a winter morning, an external security camera was intentionally blinded by an unidentified intruder wearing a mask and gloves. The objective was clear: eliminate the digital eyes on the perimeter. But what that masked individual failed to comprehend was that a silent internal monitor was still recording every single biological beat of the target inside the residence. The digital footprint left behind in this forensic matrix does not point to a chaotic neighborhood break-in or a random act of opportunistic violence. It points directly to a highly synchronized targeted operation designed specifically to bypass sophisticated local security protocols and extract a specific individual without triggering a single physical alarm. We are looking at a collision between analog intrusion and digital permanence. The external environment was compromised, but the internal biometric data was locked into an unalterable server. This creates a severe investigative paradox. Why execute such a precise, zero-footprint breach, only to leave a trail of digital breadcrumbs that investigators can trace back to the exact minute of the anomaly? The public discourse surrounding this abduction has been completely overwhelmed by baseless theories, unverified forum posts, and wild accusations directed at the wrong people. But internet rumors and social media speculation do not solve complex criminal cases. Forensic evidence, rigid digital timelines, and biological data points are the only analytical metrics that actually matter in a court of law. We must strip away the emotional narrative and focus entirely on the cold, hard data left at the scene. To keep dissecting the verifiable facts of this ongoing investigation and cutting through the dangerous online noise, subscribe to Tracking Evil with John. Reliance on a mechanical heartbeat creates a very specific type of vulnerability. When an 84-year-old woman requires a surgically implanted pacemaker and a strict regimen of daily medication to sustain fundamental biological functions, her environment must be meticulously controlled. Living independently in the affluent Catalina foothills requires layers of predictability. You do not just vanish from this type of isolated, high-security environment without disrupting a complex web of medical and logistical routines. The subject of this forensic breakdown is a woman completely tethered to these life-preserving systems. Her daily existence was mapped by the rhythmic synchronization of her medical devices with external servers, a constant digital handshake confirming her vital signs. This is not a demographic that engages in high-risk behavior or sudden, untracked departures. Every movement is calculated, every medical requirement is scheduled. The Catalina Foothills region itself provides a geographic fortress. It is an area characterized by restricted access, private roads, and extensive residential surveillance networks. To breach this perimeter requires either intimate knowledge of the target routines or an astonishing level of brazen calculation. The tension inherent in this environment is the false sense of total security. High walls and expensive cameras create an illusion of safety, but they also create an isolated theater for anyone capable of bypassing them. The anomaly here is the absolute mismatch between the target profile and the tactical nature of the extraction. Why would a highly organized intruder focus their efforts on an elderly resident reliant on constant medical intervention? There is no immediate utility in abducting someone who requires daily pharmaceutical support just to survive. The logistical burden of keeping the target alive post-extraction directly contradicts the swift, clinical nature of the initial breach. This paradox forces investigators to analyze the environment not as a home, but as a compromised, sterile field. The routine of the 84-year-old resident was shattered, but the mechanisms designed to protect her failed in profound and disturbing ways. The external security measures were defeated with alarming ease, leaving only the internal, biological trackers to document the sequence of events. The unease settles in when you realize that an abduction of an elderly target reliant on daily medication requires precise, premeditated logistics, yet a medical device designed strictly to keep her alive became the absolute only witness to the exact minute she vanished into the dark. The establishment of a rigid forensic timeline is the only way to isolate the variables of this breach. We must map the sequence of verified events leading up to the absolute cessation of normal activity. On the evening of January 31st, The target mobility data presents a standard, highly predictable pattern. At precisely 5:32 in the evening, she initiated transit via a scheduled rideshare service. The destination was a family dinner at her daughter's residence. This movement establishes a verified proof of life and a baseline of normal social interaction. The evening proceeded without documented incident until the critical return phase. At 9:48 at night, she was transported back to her Catalina Foothills property. The individual facilitating this return transport was her son-in-law. This specific interaction is corroborated by official timelines released by the county sheriff department. The handover was standard. The geographic positioning data and physical mechanisms of the residence confirm the final verified domestic action. At exactly 9:50 at night, the heavy garage door closed, sealing the perimeter. From a forensic standpoint, this 9:50 timestamp represents the final moment of uncontested security. The house was locked. The target was inside. The external world was shut out. The ensuing hours present a terrifying void of verified physical activity, broken only by the later discovery of the digital anomalies. The timeline remains dark until the following morning. February 1st brought a deviation from the established routine that immediately triggered alarm protocols within the family unit. The target was scheduled to attend a virtual, online church service. For an 84-year-old woman with a highly structured schedule, missing a scheduled virtual appointment is not an oversight. It is a massive red flag, indicating systemic disruption. By 11 o'clock in the morning, family members initiated a physical wellness check at the residence. The environment they encountered was fundamentally altered. The perimeter was intact, but the subject was gone. The transition from a secure residential status at 9:50 the previous night to a complete absence by 11 the next morning forces a meticulous review of the intervening hours. The physical environment inside the home did not reflect a chaotic struggle. It did not present the standard indicators of a violent, randomized home invasion. Law enforcement personnel arriving at the scene were confronted with a sterile void. The absence of the target was absolute, but the physical structure of the home pointed to a highly specific, targeted operation rather than a random break-in. The residence was empty, but the structural integrity and the lack of generalized ransacking indicated that whoever breached the perimeter knew exactly what they were looking for, and more importantly, exactly who they were looking for. The forensic vacuum between the garage door closing and the morning discovery is shattered by a single, catastrophic piece of visual evidence. When federal investigators pulled the data from the external security apparatus, they isolated the exact moment of the perimeter breach. At exactly 1:47 in the morning, on February 1st, the digital shield of the residence was aggressively neutralized. The footage captured an unidentified individual approaching the front door. This subject was masked. This subject was wearing gloves. The physical movements were calculated, deliberate, and entirely devoid of hesitation. The target of this individual was not the door lock, nor was it a window. The immediate target was the external camera itself. The intruder reached up and physically disconnected the surveillance equipment, plunging the external perimeter recording into total darkness. This action at 1:47 in the morning is the critical pivot point of the entire case. It demonstrates prior reconnaissance. The intruder knew the exact location of the camera, the exact angle of the lens, and the precise mechanical method required to disable it without triggering a secondary alert. This level of tactical awareness completely eliminates the theory of a disorganized or opportunistic criminal element. But the psychological profile of the incident fractures when we analyze the aftermath of the breach. In standard home invasions executed with this level of perimeter neutralization, the primary objective is almost universally financial extraction. Burglary crews disable cameras to steal high-value assets. Yet, official incident reports confirm that no significant items of monetary value were removed from the property. The expensive electronics, the assets within the home, all remained untouched. The objective was not property. The objective was the 84-year-old resident. The physical evidence left in the wake of this targeted extraction escalated the severity of the investigation from a missing persons case to a violent abduction. Investigators processing the immediate exterior of the compromised front door documented a highly disturbing biological anomaly. A light, erratic trail of blood was located just outside the threshold. Subsequent forensic laboratory testing confirmed a direct genetic match. The blood belonged to the target. The presence of this biological material indicates physical trauma occurring exactly at the point of extraction. The intruder bypassed neighborhood security protocols, surgically disabled the digital monitoring systems, ignored every item of financial value, and vanished into the night with an elderly, medically vulnerable target. But in their calculated rush to execute this zero-footprint abduction, they left something physical behind that would completely derail the initial trajectory of the investigation and force federal authorities to rethink the entire profile of the perpetrator. If you want to understand how forensic analysts decode these microscopic errors left at violent crime scenes, hit subscribe to join the forensic breakdown. The discovery of the target blood outside the threshold immediately initiated a highly aggressive forensic sweep of the entire property grid. When physical trauma is confirmed at an abduction site, the probability of perpetrator DNA transfer increases exponentially. Crime scene technicians systematically swabbed every point of entry, every microscopic disturbance in the dust, and the immediate perimeter where the blood trail was documented. This clinical search yielded a critical piece of biological data. Trace amounts of unknown biological DNA were successfully collected from the scene. This was not a degraded or partial sample. It was robust enough to run against known genetic databases. The immediate comparative analysis ruled out the target. More importantly, it completely ruled out the inner circle. The genetic material did not match the son-in-law, nor did it match any family members who had legitimate access to the property. We now had a verified, biological ghost present at the exact location of the breach. While forensic scientists in the laboratory were attempting to sequence this unknown genetic profile, federal investigators were suddenly dragged into a chaotic digital diversion. In the highly publicized hours following the abduction, the family of the target began receiving direct, targeted electronic communications. These communications were explicit ransom demands, leveraging the desperate situation for immediate financial payout. The digital footprint of these texts triggered an instantaneous federal response. Cybercrimes units traced the routing data, IP addresses, and cellular tower pings, pulling critical resources away from the physical ground search in Arizona. The electronic trail led investigators across state lines, terminating in California. A tactical operation resulted in the arrest of an individual named Derek Colella. However, the subsequent interrogation and digital forensics revealed a devastating truth. Colella had absolutely no physical connection to the extraction in the Catalina foothills. He was an opportunistic predator who had scraped the public contact information of the well, family from the massive media coverage, and attempted to extort them using fake ransom demands. The federal deployment to California was a massive expenditure of time and specialized resources, chasing a digital phantom created by a highly publicized news cycle. This creates a severe operational bottleneck. The media attention required to find a missing person simultaneously generates a massive volume of white noise, false leads, and opportunistic scams that paralyze the analytical processing of the actual evidence. Every federal agent deployed to track down the fake ransom texts in California was an agent not analyzing the physical evidence in Arizona. And while the highest levels of federal law enforcement were being systematically distracted by this cruel digital extortion plot, the actual physical crime scene back at the Catalina foothills residence was facing a catastrophic and entirely preventable crisis. The perimeter established to protect the microscopic evidence, the very environment that yielded the unknown genetic material, was being actively compromised. The rigid protocols required to maintain the integrity of a forensic sterile field were disintegrating under the pressure of the localized search efforts. While the federal authorities were forced to chase digital ghosts and fake ransom demands all the way to California, the physical crime scene in Arizona was being systematically contaminated and degraded by the very people who were officially tasked with trying to secure it. When investigating a severe localized perimeter breach, the initial hours are absolutely paramount for securing trace evidence. The physical environment must be immediately locked down, categorized, and treated as a fragile ecosystem where even the slightest misstep can irrevocably destroy the narrative of the crime. But the organizational response to this specific disappearance triggered a procedural nightmare that threatens to dismantle any future prosecution. During the expansive grid searches executed in the immediate vicinity of the property, recovery teams meticulously bagged 16 separate gloves scattered across the brush and adjacent pathways. In a vacuum, This discovery suggests a disorganized suspect discarding critical physical evidence while fleeing the immediate zone. It presented a massive potential breakthrough, offering 16 independent surfaces capable of harboring epithelial cells, sweat, or trace genetic material left behind by the individual who bypassed the camera network. However, the subsequent audit of this recovered evidence revealed a staggering and catastrophic operational failure. Out of the 16 gloves collected and logged into evidence, forensic analysts determined that 15 of them were actually discarded by the official search personnel themselves. The very individuals deployed to meticulously comb the terrain for clues were actively shedding their own protective gear directly onto the designated search grid. This is not merely a logistical embarrassment. It is a fundamental destruction of crime scene integrity. When law enforcement officers contaminate an active search zone with their own biological material, they create a massive localized obfuscation that makes it nearly impossible to isolate the true suspect profile from the newly introduced noise. The introduction of 15 foreign, officially sourced items into the evidence pool completely nullifies the evidentiary value of that specific grid. It forces laboratory technicians to waste critical processing hours, eliminating the genetic profiles of the searchers rather than identifying the perpetrator. This cascading series of tactical errors immediately drew intense, localized scrutiny toward the leadership overseeing the operation. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos found himself positioned at the absolute center of a furious storm regarding the administrative management of the initial response. The public and media backlash intensified as details emerged regarding the premature release of the primary residence back to the family. Standard forensic protocol dictates that a suspected extraction site must remain under strict official control until every conceivable microscopic layer has been analyzed, documented, and officially cleared by senior technicians. Releasing a scene prematurely drastically compromises the chain of custody. It allows civilian foot traffic to re-enter the environment, permanently altering the spatial relationships of remaining trace elements and providing defense attorneys with a limitless arsenal of reasonable doubt. If a defense team can visually demonstrate to a jury that the lead investigative agency allowed its own deputies to litter the search area with discarded protective equipment, they can systematically dismantle the credibility of any physical evidence subsequently recovered from that same compromised perimeter. The remaining glove, the single item out of the 16 that did not belong to the responding personnel, was located approximately 2 miles away from the primary extraction zone. After a rigorous laboratory analysis, the biological material recovered from this singular piece of evidence was successfully traced back to a local restaurant employee. This individual possessed absolutely no connection to the victim, the residence, or the localized geographic area. The isolated glove was simply ambient environmental debris, utterly unrelated to the orchestrated nighttime breach. This revelation served only to underscore the profound futility of the compromised grid search. The investigative resources had been completely saturated by manufactured noise. The burden of leadership in these high-stakes operations requires absolute adherence to protocol, yet the documented reality of this response points to a rushed, disorganized deployment. Every compromised surface, every contaminated footprint left by an official responder, serves to insulate the true perpetrator from justice. The architectural integrity of a criminal prosecution rests entirely on the verifiable purity of the evidence collected during those first critical hours. When that purity is compromised by the very agency tasked with preserving it, the entire legal foundation begins to fracture. The intense focus on the localized leadership was not merely political posturing, it was a direct response to a terrifying realization. The meticulous precision demonstrated by the suspect who breached the property was met with an astonishing lack of forensic discipline by the responding units. This stark contrast creates a massive vulnerability in the pursuit of justice. The biggest threat to securing a long-term criminal conviction in this complex operation was not just the masked individual who meticulously blinded the external monitors. It was the catastrophic sequence of chain of custody failures executed by the local authorities operating on the ground. If you want the facts, not the forums, subscribe to Tracking Evil with John. While the physical crime scene was deteriorating into a compromised grid of discarded official gear and contaminated pathways, a silent, unalterable timeline was quietly finalizing itself deep within the digital architecture of the victim, The external surveillance had been physically severed, but the internal biological surveillance network continued to operate exactly as engineered. This case relies on understanding the microscopic intersections of human biology and wireless telemetry. The implantable medical device regulating the cardiac rhythms of the missing woman was not an isolated, closed-loop system. It was a sophisticated piece of modern medical hardware designed to continuously monitor, record, and transmit physiological data to external receivers. This constant digital handshake is intended to provide medical professionals with real-time updates regarding cardiac performance, battery life, and any potentially dangerous arrhythmias. But in the context of an abduction, this life-saving transmitter transforms into the ultimate incorruptible witness. Federal cyber technicians, working in parallel with the chaotic physical search, immediately issued subpoenas to the manufacturers of the implanted hardware and the associated digital infrastructure. They sought the raw telemetry logs, the microscopic packets of data that would reveal the exact physiological state of the victim in the hours following the garage door closure. The retrieved data logs provided a chilling, undeniable timestamp that permanently locked the parameters of the investigation. At exactly 2:28 in the morning, the internal cardiac device initiated its final, successful synchronization with the external communication modules located within the residence. This synchronization confirmed that the device was still within the localized wireless transmission range of the home network at that exact moment. More importantly, it confirmed that the biological host was still generating the necessary electrical impulses to power the internal system. The 2:28 morning timestamp is the absolute edge of the known universe in this case. Following that precise microscopic data transfer, the connection was permanently severed. The device never pinged the home network again. It never synchronized with any external cellular tower, nor did it register on any ambient wireless networks in the surrounding geographic area. The cessation of transmission could mean the device was moved beyond the operational range of any receiving node, or it could indicate a sudden, catastrophic biological failure of the host. Regardless of the mechanical reason for the silence, that exact minute represents the permanent, verifiable end of the localized timeline. We possess the hard data, proving the target was still within proximity of the internal receivers roughly 40 minutes after the external camera was manually dismantled. This specific window of time forces a terrifying realization regarding the nature of the breach. The perpetrator did not simply grab the target and flee in a chaotic panic. They remained within the operational radius of the property for a significant duration, operating with a chilling level of comfort in a highly vulnerable environment. While this rigid digital boundary was being established, the federal laboratory processing the uncontaminated trace biological material made a crucial tactical decision. Recognizing the rapid degradation of the physical leads and the immense pressure of the compromised ground search, authorities authorized the immediate expedition of the unknown genetic profile for advanced forensic genetic genealogy testing. This is not a standard, localized database query. This is the deployment of cutting-edge biological mapping. By analyzing the complex sequence of the unknown sample, geneticists can identify distant familial markers, constructing expansive family trees that span generations. This process systematically narrows the global population down to specific regional bloodlines, eventually pointing investigators toward a concentrated pool of relatives. It transforms a microscopic drop of biological material into a highly detailed map of human ancestry, bypassing the need for the suspect to have a prior criminal record in the standard localized databases. The deployment of this advanced sequencing technology is an aggressive pivot away from the contaminated, physical environment and toward the unalterable truth of cellular biology. The digital timeline is locked. We know the exact chronological parameters down to the absolute minute, but this immense technological clarity only deepens the central mystery. The motive reveals a terrifying gap between the astonishing precision of the nighttime execution and the total absence of any verified demands. The digital ghosts have been cleared, the cardiac telemetry has drawn a hard line in the sand, but the true identity of the individual operating within that narrow window remains entirely concealed. The collision of absolute digital certainty and total physical anonymity creates an investigative paradox that continues to baffle federal profilers. To understand how forensic genealogy bridges the gap between trace cells and a name, Subscribe as we track the final pieces of evidence. The establishment of this rigid, scientifically verified sequence of events provided law enforcement with the necessary tools to begin systematically dismantling the massive wave of public speculation. In high-profile disappearances, the immediate social response is almost always a localized witch hunt. The public consciousness instinctively recoils from the idea of a random, faceless predator operating with such surgical precision. It is psychologically easier for the precision community to believe that the threat originated from within the established social circle of the victim. This innate human bias fueled a relentless campaign of online accusations directed explicitly at the family members who were desperately trying to coordinate the search efforts. The son-in-law, who had facilitated the final verified transport of the evening, became the primary target of this baseless digital vitriol. Armchair investigators dissected his every public statement, analyzing his body language through the distorted lens of profound grief and shock. They constructed elaborate, entirely fictional narratives, detailing complex financial motives and hidden resentments, projecting their own morbid fantasies onto a family actively experiencing an unimaginable trauma. The digital mob essentially convicted an innocent man, based on nothing more than the uncomfortable optics of a family in crisis. However, the relentless application of the newly established forensic data completely obliterated these manufactured theories. The localized sheriff department, utilizing the unalterable digital timeline and the precise cellular mapping of the immediate family members, initiated a comprehensive review of all alibis. The physical location of the son-in-law during the critical window between the camera neutralization and the final cardiac transmission was rigorously corroborated by independent, objective data points. He was not present at the extraction site. He did not possess the opportunity to execute the breach, nor did his biological profile align with the microscopic trace evidence recovered near the primary threshold. Armed with this conclusive analytical proof, the official investigative command made a definitive, public declaration. The son-in-law was officially and entirely cleared of any suspicion or involvement in the disappearance. This exoneration was not based on subjective interviews or emotional appeals. It was grounded entirely in the immovable bedrock of technological and biological fact. The official clearance extended beyond a single individual, systematically ruling out the entire inner circle of legitimate access. The family was formally removed from the suspect matrix. This clinical elimination of the most statistically probable suspects forces the investigation into a much darker, far more terrifying trajectory. The phantom who meticulously disabled the perimeter monitoring and orchestrated the silent extraction was not a disgruntled relative or a familiar acquaintance harboring a secret grievance. It was an external, highly capable entity operating with an unknown agenda. The statistical rarity of a stranger abduction targeting an 84-year-old woman is staggering. Criminal enterprises prioritize efficiency and return on investment. The logistical nightmare of securing, transporting, and maintaining the vital functions of a medically fragile captive fundamentally contradicts the standard operational playbook of an organized syndicate. Yet, the physical evidence overwhelmingly proves that this is exactly what occurred. The intruder bypassed numerous affluent targets, ignored high-value portable assets, and focused entirely on a human objective that required constant, specialized care. This completely shatters conventional criminal profiling. We are forced to consider the existence of a predator whose motivations exist entirely outside the recognizable spectrum of financial gain or interpersonal revenge. This is the valley of the investigation, the terrifying space where all logical theories have been scientifically debunked, leaving only the most alarming possibilities. The clearance of the familial circle removes the comfortable illusion of domestic conflict and replaces it with the stark reality of a calculating, invisible threat capable of penetrating highly secure environments without leaving a recognizable footprint. The family is definitively cleared. The digital timeline is utterly rigid, but the masked intruder remains a completely unidentified phantom, deeply embedded in the forensic data. The central, agonizing question of why this specific, vulnerable target was selected remains unanswered, leaving a chilling void at the center of the analytical matrix. What this case teaches us about modern forensic reliance is deeply unsettling. We operate under the collective assumption that advancing technology creates an impenetrable net of justice. We believe that cellular tracking, advanced biometric synchronization, and microscopic genetic analysis have rendered the perfect crime an impossibility. Investigation. This investigation proves that assumption is a dangerous fallacy. The technological architecture of the home functioned flawlessly. The implanted medical devices faithfully transmitted their final morbid updates to the servers. The external monitors captured the exact moment of the physical breach. The federal laboratories successfully isolated the microscopic genetic code of the masked intruder. The science did not fail. The human element failed on a massive scale. The catastrophic mismanagement of the physical environment by the very personnel tasked with securing it demonstrates that the most advanced forensic tools in the world are utterly useless if the foundational chain of custody is broken. The bedrock of any criminal prosecution is the absolute, verifiable purity of the physical location. When search teams casually discard their own protective equipment across a critical evidentiary zone, they hand defense attorneys the ultimate legal weapon: reasonable doubt. A defense lawyer does not need to prove their client is completely innocent. They only need to prove that the state cannot guarantee the pristine nature of the gathered evidence. By contaminating the physical pathways, the localized authorities inadvertently built a robust, impenetrable legal shield for the perpetrator. This creates a terrifying legal paradox, where federal investigators may eventually identify the exact individual responsible through advanced genetic tracing, but remain entirely powerless to secure a conviction in a court of law. The heavy reliance on digital infallibility blinded the operational command to the absolute necessity of rigorous, disciplined physical scene management. Technology provides the unalterable timeline, but simple human error destroys the eventual conviction. The unalterable digital timeline remains locked. The massive failures of the physical ground search have been extensively documented and analyzed. The inner circle has been completely exonerated by the rigid application of hard data. All that remains now is the painstaking, microscopic work of the federal geneticists. They possess the biological blueprint of the phantom who bypassed the perimeter. The advanced genealogical sequencing is actively running, comparing the unknown genetic markers against vast databases of human ancestry, slowly narrowing the global population down to a single, localized bloodline. And identification is no longer a matter of possibility. It is strictly a matter of time. The science will eventually provide a name, but the lingering, analytical nightmare that continues to haunt this investigation is not about identification. It is about prosecution. When the laboratory finally matches that specific trace biology to a living suspect, will the severely contaminated environment of the primary extraction zone be enough to let a calculated kidnapper walk entirely free? The technological net is closing, but the legal foundation is crumbling. To ensure you never miss an update as we track the final results of this unprecedented genetic manhunt, subscribe to Tracking Evil with John. I will see you in the next case file.